Greetings. I'm going to be speaking about the James Bond business. Now, of all the things you could speak about, few could be more daunting than this. Clearly, I don't have either the charisma or the good looks or the insouciance, as the French would say, to speak about the subject. But I'll give it a go. I'll give it a bash. So three questions arise when we discuss this topic. First, who's James Bond? Two, what is the James Bond business? And three, why is this business important? All right, so let's give it a bash. Who is James Bond? Well, we all know he happens to be a fictional character, appears in movies, drives fancy cars, sleeps with beautiful women, drinks his martinis shaken, not stirred. He works for MI6. He's 007, like Cristiano Ronaldo, who's also 7. Well, Cristiano Ronaldo is the James Bond of football. But anyway, James Bond, if you take a step back, is a fictional character created first by Ian Fleming. Now, Ian lived from 1908 to 1964, educated at Eton, which is where Duke of Wellington went to school, and also a chubby Boris Johnson. After that, Sandhurst, Munich, I believe he was also at Geneva. And he led a life which was wild and fast and loose, and he only came into his own in World War II. When he worked as an administrator, he created a number 30 unit, if I remember correctly, and this went behind enemy lines and people in small numbers blew things up. Now, actually, there was a chap who created the Special Air Service. Sir David Stirling, if I remember correctly. I should remember correctly. He was a tall, handsome chap, much more operational than Ian. And perhaps he might have been an inspiration for Ian. We'll never know. I don't know. I'm not an expert on Ian Fleming. But what I do know is that this idea of James Bond is a much souped-up, glamorized version of something which is somewhat based in reality. The Special Air Service was phenomenal. The founding team had 6 officers and 60 men. 6 officers, 60 men. They went behind enemy lines in North Africa. They blew up airplanes, damaged enemy posts. They were just extraordinarily impressive. Today, the SAS has a glamour, has a reputation, and exudes a certain fear because it began and it continues with a certain degree of code, clinical professionalism, and extraordinary daring-do. Now, James Bond is this figure who's taken from fiction and then blown up on movies. And the movies are seen around the world. British accent, black tuxedo, always immaculately dressed, even when he jumps off planes and trains and bridges. And the suit miraculously doesn't suffer too much damage for all that action. It's much better stitched than my suit. And of course, James Bond has fans around the world. So what is the James Bond business? Well, you could look at it through three prisms. Well, the first prism is, it's the movie business. It's a fantastically successful movie business. 27 movies, 27 of them, with loyal fans, a franchise, sells multi-billion-dollar products, or supports multi-billion-dollar markets, products in multi-billion-dollar markets. James Bond's watch, car, pistol, all of that promotes a brand, or promotes different brands. And of course, the movies bring in revenue, and then they help sell a whole bunch of other things. So on the one hand, it is classic Hollywood with a British twist. So those movies help support a certain narrative. They uphold a certain culture. And they bring to the table a projection of soft power, British soft power. There's a reason, a key reason why James Bond is called the anointed son of British culture. In the Olympics, James Bond is seen escorting the Queen in the opening ceremony. That's for a reason. So, at a superficial level, it's the movie business, yes, and that movie business creates a certain mystique around Britain, and it upholds a certain narrative that the British always save the world. It falls in line with the long tradition of British heroes, from Horatio Nelson to Duke of Wellington, and of course now James Bond. All of them fight the baddies. All of them risk their lives. All of them emerge triumphant. All of them are cool under pressure, and their finger never wavers on the trigger. Jolly good. There's another prism through which you can view. When you suddenly see James Bond, the latest movie, there's a British destroyer launching missiles. You know, they're doing things independent of the CIA. And what that tells you is, hang on a minute, to do all of this, subconsciously, subliminally, you're realizing Britain is projecting defense, diplomacy, and intelligence, all three. They're projecting power across the world. Now, if you look at it through that prism, James Bond is just a metaphor for projection of state power. We can appear anywhere to fight for the good, and the good is what we define as good. And we are the ones who will save you, and you from the baddies. Now there's a reason, remember, there's a reason why you don't have a Francois. You don't have a Vladimir. You don't have a Fritz saving the world. Think about it. These are all fairly successful countries. There was a time the Soviet Union was quite powerful. Its ideology was a big draw. We have members in the audience with gray hair who can tell you all about the power, the seductive power of Marx and Lenin. Not to speak about Mao, but certainly Marx and Lenin and even Stalin and Trotsky. But there weren't such heroes going around bang, 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 and sleeping with beautiful girls in the process, and driving fast cars with cavalier abandon. One often wonders what would be the environmental footprint of James Bond. Has anyone done an audit There are lots of people here in this audience, younger people, who care about climate change. Perhaps that might be a good idea. But we won't bother ourselves with detail, schmetail. The key thing is, James Bond represents something which is best exemplified by Britain, which had an empire, the biggest empire, but also by other powers of the West. A universalist creed, a creed that believes in domination, a creed that defines the moral envelope, not just for itself, but for the planet. And James Bond, with his dress, with his drinks, with his lifestyle, with his looks, is the personification or the on-screen avatar of a Horatio Nelson or a Duke of Wellington. So much so for this prism. If we were to take a more specific prism, the third prism, James Bond really is representative or a personification or a symbol of the importance British culture in particular, and also American culture and many major powers, and especially Western powers, accord to intelligence. Guess what? He's a secret agent. Guess what? He's supported by a whole army of people, sort of, in the background. You know, there are people making guns for him, people making gadgets for him, people providing him tech support these days, some geeky people. There are people arranging stuff for him, including, of course, his wonderfully hand-stitched, I presume, jackets. And what this shows is that in the cultural consciousness of former imperial powers, the importance of intelligence is burnt indelibly in their psyche. Remember, the British would have never, ever taken over Africa, leave aside India, if they didn't have good intelligence. In Afghanistan, Rory Stewart, who is rumored to be an ex-MI6 chap, who walked all the way from Turkey to Afghanistan and beyond, talks about one of the first intelligence agents who went to Kabul and had his head eventually chopped off. He was hacked to death. Sikandar Burns. Kim, the great novel by Rudyard Kipling, is all about the great game. It's about a great game that the Russians and the British are playing. So in that psyche, the James Bond figure is a key figure, because without key information, you cannot act. Without intelligence, you fail. Ipso facto, you accord a really high importance to the chap who is your secret agent. Culturally, the French don't do that. They do. I mean, to be fair, to some degree, but not quite like the British. The Americans do give some importance, but not quite like the British. The Brazilians, their intelligence, give me a break. Indians, well, you don't need to talk too much about that, do we? And the question is why? And the question is why, and the answer is very simple. This is simply because Britain needed extraordinary intelligence, deft diplomacy, and a very calibrated use of force to become a global power. They didn't do what the Nazis did, just roll in militarily, send people off to concentration camps, turned the Ukrainians against them, who were welcoming them initially as liberators from the Soviet Union. At least some of the Ukrainians were, until they discovered mein Gott, we are Untermensch for the Germans. The Germans did not know how to play divide and rule. To play divide and rule, you need to know. You need to know which tribe dislikes which other tribes. You need to know what castes are in conflict, what regions are in conflict, what religions are in conflict, and then you can play them off against each other. And at the height of the British Empire, there were, if I remember correctly, just 6,000 Brits ruling 200 million Indians. So guess what? If you've got to do that, is intelligence important? Yes or no? Yes? Excellent. All right. So much so for looking at James Bond through these three prisms. Why is the James Bond business important today? And the James Bond business, you could say, first, it's important because of money. It makes a lot of cash, great, jolly good. Second, you could say it's very important because it's important to continue a certain projection of culture. As I said, narratives, culture, soft power, you uphold it, invest in it, perpetuate it, great. Like football, like the English language, like common law, like democracy in its modern form. Parliamentary democracy, first past the post system, is all based on Britain. Even the Americans follow common law. So along with that, James Bond is useful. All of this adds up. Maybe the others are like bricks, and James Bond is just a little decorative piece on the big structure, but all of that adds up. All right. What else could be the reason why is the James Bond business important? Well, if you look at it from the point of view of culture, it's important because of these reasons. But if you look at it through the prism of defense, diplomacy, and intelligence, the James Bond business is important, particularly today, because we are increasingly living in a more dangerous world. There's a reason why the Chinese are investing so much in intelligence. MSS, the Chinese Secret Service, has been stealing industrial secrets and whatnot from the US. In fact, the FBI is bringing prosecution cases of espionage against so many Chinese agents in America. And by the way, espionage cases, as my co-author, Glenn Carl, who retired from the CIA, constantly says, are notoriously difficult to bring. And of course, this ex-CIA man is worried, a bit worried. The Chinese are literally trying their best to get their hands on all kinds of secrets, particularly technological. And they're not very good at other stuff. They're not at all good at narratives. They tried making fun of James Bond. They made a spoof, which was terrible, had no humor, was dull, tedious, and actually showed that they should stick to stealing secrets instead of making videos making fun of James Bond. In fact, the MI6 chief thanked them for free publicity. The important thing is that the Chinese are active. The Russians, as we know, are very active. The Russians have always been good at this. The Soviet Union had a very powerful tool, a seductive tool, its ideology, which brought in idealistic true believers from Cambridge in particular to betray their own countrymen and pass on secrets to the Soviet Union for years, for decades. And so many countries around the world had Soviet agents because they genuinely believed in communism. There were Soviet agents in as far-flung areas as Argentina, Chile, India, Congo, all over the map. It was staggering. And today, they may not have the ideological appeal, but they're still good at spying business. They're also good at defense. Maybe they are not so good at diplomacy. Maybe they are actually. Look at what they are doing in Ukraine. Look at the projection of power the Russians have done, not just in Ukraine, but in Kazakhstan recently, Syria, Libya. The Wagner Group is operating in Africa, in the Middle East. And so, in a way, Russia is back. It may have a terrible economy, but it is back. Nord Stream 2 has divided Europe. So Russia has certainly projected its defense, diplomacy, and intelligence. Sorry, definitely projected its power in recent years and used its defense, diplomacy, and intelligence to do so. Very important to remember that. So the Chinese are active, the Russians are active, the Americans continue to be active. They, of course, have 800 military bases. The British, yes, they are playing a game. The FCO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, is not what it once used to be, nor is the MI6 what it once was. The SAS is also not quite the same force it was. It's got great people, but Britain, post-Brexit, is going through, shall we say, a bit of a self-examination. But of course, there are smaller powers with powerful intelligence agencies. The Israelis, with their Mossad, with their military intelligence, with their Shin Bet, they're doing a good job. There was a certain incident in Iran, a spectacular one, in which a particular Iranian scientist miraculously died. Surprise, surprise. Of course, the inter-services intelligence has supported the Taliban. Before that, they supported the Mujahideen. And of course, they support jihad in Kashmir. So, the projection of power, state power, and the protection of state interests is a dangerous game and is now being played with greater intensity. And people are using defense diplomacy and intelligence now to greater effect. The Chinese and the Russians just sailed their fleet around Japan, lest we forget, not too long ago. So focusing further on, zoning further on, intelligence now becomes extremely important. Let's say if we knew exactly what Vladimir Putin was planning in Ukraine, would that be helpful? Of course. If we knew that the Israelis were about to strike in Iran, if nothing else, you could buy oil. Oil prices would shoot up, wouldn't they? So intelligence is becoming more and more critical now to look at the James Bond business from that prism, because it's getting to be a more dangerous world. Unlike earlier times where you had limited information, now you have a sea of information. So intelligence is not just about somebody going somewhere and befriending a local person or sleeping with a beautiful woman, the wife of someone important, and getting whispers on the pillow. It's also a lot about tech. There's so much information, but then it's not just tech. You've got to sift signal from noise, because it's very easy to get lost in noise. It is also fundamentally now about narratives. As Vikram Sood, another co-author who was the chief of RAW, said, and he's written in his book, which is about narratives, about constructing a narrative about your nation, about your state, about your society, about your civilization. Much in the same way, the British as a whole have created a certain narrative about themselves for the world, as have the Americans, the great American dream. Indiana Jones, not as seductive as James Bond, but still, there was a time Indiana Jones was very popular. And so, now that I have told you who's James Bond, what is the James Bond business, And why is this business important? I rest my case and I'm open to questions. Thank you very much.
So what kind of laws are intelligence agencies subject to in terms of especially human rights and things like that? Are there global laws? Is it the UN that plays a role? Because they clearly do a lot of activities that are, maybe under normal circumstances would not even be considered legal, I suppose.
I think that's a very good question, because intelligence agencies are supposed to largely, at least in countries with good rule of law, stay on the right side of the law. There have been allegations that the CIA has been involved in torture, and actually Glenn wrote an entire book about that. And yes, those standards slipped under George W. Bush. But largely, the difference between, let's say, give you a precise example. The difference between, let's say, a CIA and an MI6 and, let's say, FSB and MSS, FSB is the Russian equivalent, is that the Russians wouldn't think twice about using polonium as they did, poisoning. All right, it was extraordinary, breathtaking. Whilst the CIA has its history of conducting coups, 1953 in Iran, so many coups in Latin America, generally the CIA has more constraints because if for nothing else, they say they are a democracy, so they can't be seen as too cavalier. So they may do things, but at least they'll try to hide them. Whilst FSB and MSS, they do willy-nilly anything. So, the laws are applicable in states where you have systems to impose them. And there, everyone largely stays on the right side of law. I cannot imagine any intelligence agency, for instance, going completely crazy in Germany, or for that matter, France, or UK, or Denmark, or even the US. But in Africa, sure, it's open season. If it's Afghanistan, then you just send drones. You don't even risk your men. And yes, if there are collateral casualties, so be it. But if you're the US, you try to minimize them quite often. If for nothing else, for public relations reasons. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Good to know. Yeah. It largely does. Since you asked for a precise example, the MSS is the Israeli agency?
MSS is the Chinese. Mossad is the Israeli.
Right.
Yeah.
So the assassination that you alluded to during your talk, the assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientist.
That was probably Mossad.
Right.
Yeah, it was a very sophisticated operation.
Yes, and I think they did take credit for it, and I believe the commentary from America was that the killing was criminal and reckless. So that is why I was wondering what kinds of are these international laws that govern them, because the assassination did not happen on Israeli land. So what? But if it's carried out by an Israeli agency, then what laws are they subject to?
The Mossad is the true James Bond of today. They shoot first and ask questions later.
Fair enough.
And who's going to bring them to trial? They are a very strong ally of the US.
Yes, exactly.
And by the way, they operated in a state which is also a theocracy, which kills a lot of people. So then the question arises, how do you deal with such a state? Can you deal with such a state with due process?
Yes, exactly. So there, I was wondering about whether there are mechanisms of law that go beyond states, and what kind of international bodies.
There are attempts. There is the International Criminal Court, but America hasn't signed on to it.
Right.
The most powerful countries are not going to sign.
Yeah, probably it's in their own interest to not subscribe or make these attempts actually serious. So that's fascinating. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Hi, good evening, Professor. My question is that this about the defense, diplomacy, and intelligence soft power. Isn't it more based on the economic soft power that the countries have, like the Britain? It used to have that soft power that it's projecting now, but now that it has not too long ago exited from European Union, the Brexit, and after that, like even now, the Russia is able to show its influence over Ukraine because it holds soft power over European Union and others because of its supply of oil, especially because the prices of oil are rising and countries have fear over inflation. So isn't it so that the intelligence more or less also depends on the other forms of soft power such as economic and sports?
This is a very good question, and you're going back to Marx and Madonna. Madonna sang, "It's a material world and I'm a material girl." Who's heard that song? We can play that. Yeah. And Marx believed that everything came from, material circumstances determined everything. And Weber said, hang on a minute, it's culture that determines whether you're wealthy or not. The Protestant countries had less resources, but they ended up being richer. So India was much richer, actually, than Central Asia. Where did Babur come from? Modern-day Uzbekistan.
So
okay?
The way it is like, these are all the pillars of kind of our soft power, the economic.
Hold fire. Don't get lost. I'm just giving you a historical example, okay? Babur came from Uzbekistan. Fargana Valley, Bukhara, Samarkand, all these cities were, the domain of Babur. He was part Mongol, part Turk. He wasn't rich. He came to India to loot and rule. You can read Baburnama. He talks about the fertile soil of India, the many crafts of India. What did he have about India that the Indians didn't have about him? Intelligence. He knew about India. He had heard about India from travelers. He had, in his own way, studied what India offered. So he swept down through Afghanistan from Khyber into the Indus plains and then from Indus to the Ganges. So intelligence is helped by economics, but it is not just economics that determines whether you have good intelligence. Germany is a bigger economy than the UK. Germany doesn't have great intelligence. Japan is a bigger economy than the UK and Russia. Russia is a very small country. Japan is a huge economy. Huge economy. Japan invests big time in the US. Japan invests in Europe. Japan invests in Taiwan. Japan invests in India. But Japan doesn't really have an intelligence service. Pourquoi? Think about it.
So that's true. I agree with the point about Japan, but about the Mughals and the Babur that came, they had better army than us. So that was also one of the reasons. So it's more like
hold fire. They also chose the right battlefields to fight their battles. All right?
Agreed.
In 1527, they chose to fight the Rajputs in Kanwa. So they studied the terrain. They had better local intelligence than the local kings. So they had better military, and often you'll find that military intelligence and diplomacy are linked, and especially military and intelligence. You just simply cannot have a good military operation without good intelligence. That simply is impossible. Okay? So when you say, oh, they had good military, well, yes, but they also knew the terrain, they went out, they brought back news, they were explorers at that time. They were explorers on horseback, not on sea, but they were explorers. Indians were not at that time. Okay? With me?
Yes, agree. And my second question is that in this emerging the economy of intelligence, where intelligence is being used as software, how do you think India is developing its intelligence services? The raw and all of that, like, are they emerging and are they developing? Is India investing enough in that?
India needs to do a lot. India still has a colonial state. and India is trapped in colonial era recruitment, training, and evaluation systems. We have to modernize the state. We have to professionalize the state. I would say we need fundamental reforms.
Yes, totally agree. Fundamental reforms are needed. But just by talking about, even if like those fundamental reforms, they can't be done because of all of the politics and other things that are going on. But even after that, is how you are seeing that the draw is developing itself. Like, is it adding enough agents? Is it spreading its claws outside in the outer world?
India is unable to perform at its potential because the Indian state, I will repeat again and again, is still colonial. Why do you need one civil services exam for all services? You hold fire. The same exam puts maybe somebody who studied history in the revenue service, somebody who cannot speak in the foreign service, somebody who's an introvert to be an administrator in the administrative service, somebody who may hate numbers as the auditor. It's just an insane system. The British recruit separately for the Treasury, separately for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and separately for MI6. All right? In the US, people recruit separately for the government recruits separately for the FBI and separately for the CIA. They're two completely different personality types, completely different skill sets. In India, the Intelligence Bureau, as well as the Central Bureau of Investigation, is staffed by the Indian Police Service. And people are in the Indian Police Service only because they didn't get the Indian Administrative Service. They don't want to be there, most of them. So the Indian system is insanity. We are not just putting bullets in one of our knees, we are putting 2 bullets in each of our knees. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
And
good.
just one more question, like the corporates are emerging. A lot of corporates are rising, even of the most of the developing economies, such as Apple, Microsoft, and them. So do you think that over time, these corporates, like maybe not the tech ones, but the other ones such as Adidas and others, they might be developing their own intelligence services? Like,
Don't they
do you think
already
that kind of
have?
culture might
Don't they
emerge?
already have them? The British East India Company conquered India. Did they have good intelligence? Of course they did. So do you think Facebook has hired the former Deputy Prime Minister of the UK, none other than the very good-looking Mr. Nick Clegg, who's basically a sidekick of Mark Zuckerberg, Emperor Zuckerberg. I've written an article about it. Emperor Zuckerberg, you can read it if you're interested. Come and talk to me. I'll give you my email and you can share, you can look at the links of these articles. Of course, once any organization develops a certain amount of power, they have their own intelligence agency or intelligence operations. Henry Ford had intelligence operations to break the unions. Obviously, it'll happen. It is already happening.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Welcome.
Thank you, sir. So I remember the conversation with Vikram Sood, where he says about before writing the book, narratives. So
Could you hold it closer and speak louder, please?
Yeah, okay. Is it
Yeah,
okay?
speak a bit louder.
Yeah, is it okay? Yeah, I remember the conversation with Vikram Sood, the former R&D chief. So where he was saying before writing his book that there are no truths or lies. Only what states think the people wants to believe, they'll project that. So recently, I watched a tweet released by Chinese news agency in Xinhua, wherein they are taking Zaib about Zaiwan, the British MI6 chief, saying that China is the topmost secret agency's topmost priority, wherein they are saying that this chief is using China to secure budget for the agency. What do you say on that?
That always happens.
No, generally what I thought was Chinese diplomacy is all about wolf warriors and border incursions or economic imperialism. But what is this surprising?
Well, look, the Chinese used to be all about economic intelligence, but the Chinese are acting in a very prickly way now. Under Xi Jinping, particularly since 2013 or so, they've followed the policy of aggressive defense, and they have a wolf warrior diplomacy. So the Chinese are certainly a threat. The Russians obviously are more active, and they are acting in ways that are very innovative. I I wrote a huge article on making sense of Vladimir Putin. I recommend that all of you read it if you're interested in understanding Russia and Vladimir Putin, who's a former KGB officer. So yes, intelligence agencies often exaggerate threats to get more budgets, to have more importance, particularly in places like the US and the UK. But having said that, the threats have grown as well. And they are, at least in Europe, finally belatedly waking up to it. I think China in particular had infiltrated Western institutions through clever use of money, and Russia through its information wars. Vladislav Sirkin is one of the cleverest men alive today. No one does spin better than Sirkin. So he has really, really mastered the art of fake news and spin. Lots of people have done it for hundreds of years, but he's one of the best practitioners of spin today. So there is a real risk, and ipso facto states that are opposed to Russia's interests are countering it.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. And second question regarding is on Afghanistan, wherein the strategic fallout of US happened there. So isn't it the failure of US Central Intelligence Agency to predict that? And second,
of course, the US intelligence agency failed and failed badly, but more than that, it was the failure of the political leadership. And in particular, if you take my view, someone like the National Security Advisor, who's also an Oxford man, Jake Sullivan, misread the situation completely. The Americans really believed that someone like Ashraf Ghani was president, would fight and would be credible. I mean, he was completely corrupt. He won power in a disputed election. And the Americans didn't realize how deep the rivalries in Afghanistan run. Afghanistan is not an industrial society which has the homogeneity of Japan and Germany, which America could build after World War II. Babur came down from modern-day Uzbekistan. Who did he beat in the Battle of Panipat? He beat the Pashtuns. And then the Pashtuns pushed back the Mughals under Sher Shah Suri. And then, of course, the Mughals came back. And so unsafe was Delhi that the Mughals didn't stay. The early Mughals didn't stay in Delhi. They built their capital in Agra because both Babur and Akbar were scared of assassination in Delhi. Delhi was a Turkish Pashtun city. And Sher Shah Suri built Jarnaili Sadak, the Grand Trunk Road that runs from Afghanistan, Peshawar, edge of Afghanistan, to Murshidabad. And even today, along that road are villages of Pashtuns all the way, even in Bihar. So it's super important to remember history. And Uzbeks and Tajiks and Pashtuns have been at each other's throats. Rashid Dostum, the Uzbek leader, had killed a number of Taliban leaders. So when they created mixed units, which was ridiculously idiotic in my view, when they created mixed units, if someone whose uncle was killed by someone's father, they're never going to fight together. So there were lots and lots and lots of problems. They brought in a presidential system which doesn't work in a tribal society. They should have brought in a parliamentary system. But Americans are insular. There are two oceans separating America from the rest of the world, the Pacific and the Atlantic. Jake never worked as a soldier, never as a spy, never as an envoy. He was not a diplomat, not a military man. He was not an intelligence professional. Jake came from Oxford, golden boy, ended up working in a political campaign, then came in the State Department, didn't really live in another country other than England, which doesn't really count, and then is suddenly miraculously National Security Advisor. So he's a very pleasant chap. He's polite, well-spoken, clearly intelligent, but the crown is slipping over his ears. So it was a preposterously ludicrous decision. I predicted that Afghanistan would fall before. You can read my article. I I felt that withdrawing in summer was madness. You could have withdrawn in winter.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just, shall we say, a litany of errors. So yes, the US failed and failed badly, but it is not just the CIA's fault. In fact, some people in the CIA and some people in the Pentagon and even some people in politics said this is a bad idea. They opposed the withdrawal.
And this is third question regarding the economic diplomacy. Recently, you must have seen the tweet of Pakistan Hyundai and Kashmiri separatists, wherein it usually not happens that two foreign ministers speaking on an issue raised by a social media post, the South Korean company. So how do you think that in this time of economic diplomacy, wherein rising tensions between nations happening, how can a transnational company do business in these countries?
Oh, it's going to be difficult. I don't think it was Hyundai who tweeted it. It was one of their suppliers, who did it. So the political risk to all these companies like Hyundai is rising.
I mean, like that tweet raised that the Indian High Commission calling South Korean ambassador and then Indian High Commissioner in South Korea meeting the chief of Hyundai. So how do you see this issue?
Well, how do I see it? People are getting emotional. I think in this age of Twitter, there are lots of wolf warriors who are rather quick to express outrage, and tweets are a good way to do it. And for Hyundai, I think 3,000 of their orders were cancelled. So that's a big hit to their pocket. So it's going to become, companies will have to start telling all their dealers not to talk about politics. That might be part of their agreement. You won't tweet. You will only say completely safe things like the sun is shining bright, the sky is blue, the grass is green, God is in his heaven, and all's right with the world.
And finally, I want your views on AUKUS and Quad. So, wherein rising interest.
What do you want to know about?
So, why these three people are coming in interest of China?
AUKUS is very simple. They wanted to sell nuclear submarines to Australia, and France was selling them submarines at a higher price. So, the Anglo-Saxon powers are culturally similar. They want to draw Australia away from the arms of China. And so a nuclear submarine with Australia is sort of a good deterrent. And of course, the Anglo-Saxon powers have more in common than, let's say, with France or with India. So AUKUS deal came together. Quad it's a bit of a talking shop, really. The four powers are very different to each other. India has so many internal problems. It is so diverse. It is a bit of a circus. We have non-stop elections. But we are also, in a strange way, a powerful military power with a lot of troops. And we are the only ones right now who can go toe-to-toe with the Chinese. The big question is, if we go toe-to-toe with the Chinese, will the others be around us? We don't know. I don't think the Americans and the Australians will come running if we have a punch-up. The Japanese may, but we have to cultivate the Japanese better, much better. The Japanese are very willing and very eager to talk to us and engage with us. I think big democracies such as the US and India tend to be more insular. We've got so many things at home we cannot look out. And so I think the Quad is largely a talking shop, but it may have potential should the threat of China become real and tangible. Then there may be some closeness, greater closeness. But eventually, what I see happening is that India and Japan share more of a strategic and military commonality. India and America have much more of an economic synergy because, look, here I am speaking English, you're all using Google, the CEOs of American companies are Indians, all the children of the Indian elite, whether they are in bureaucracy or whether they are in politics, not all, but quite a few of them end up doing their undergraduate degree abroad, so they come back as mini Americans. So whether we like it or not, we were in some ways a British colony, and now we are sort of an American, I wouldn't say colony, but certainly an America-influenced country. I mean, culturally, we are very much under America's thumb. We watch American soap operas or television serials. We read their newspapers and magazines. We watch their cinema. We crave to go to American higher education schools, and we want to be CEOs of American companies. So whether we like it or not, in my generation, until my deathbed, I don't see that changing, because culturally, and this is something that struck me, because one of my interns was gutted to learn that she could not be president of the US because she was born here, and she's applying to do undergrad in America. So culturally, so many Indians are dreaming of becoming Americans, not just emulating them, but becoming Americans. That is the gold standard. And neither Donald Trump nor all the massive problems of America, the inequality and yada yada, has made a dent in that. So, India has to, and I say this repeatedly, India has to discover its cultural confidence and bravery. If we sort ourselves out and we sort out our institutions, we'll be able to have alliances, and the Americans will be better friends too. Because once you know who you are and they know who they are, you can have a chat. Yes. But if you're trying to be them, then they don't know who you are. It becomes difficult to have a chat.
And finally, the question related to the recently US moved a motion against Ukraine in the US Security Council. But what surprised me is like India neither taking a stand against it or for it. So they just dropped off. They don't want to disappoint Russia, and then as well as they don't want to disappoint US as well. Why? So why can't India take a stand against of?
Well, where does India get its S-400s from? Where is the Sukhoi jet from? Russia, you need spare parts, don't you? Do you need energy? All right, where do you get your capital from? Blackstone has invested $70 billion in India. Google has big operations here. Do you want to upset the Americans? No. You're flirting with both of them. Do you want to annoy either of them? You've got to keep flirting.
So, how do these services work in a country like North Korea, where the information getting out is much more restricted?
Well, North Korea, I'm sure, does quite all right, as does Cuba. The Cuban Secret Service is probably the best, even better than the Mossad as per Glenn Carl. And I'm sure North Korea is fine because their existence depends on it. But otherwise, other than that, I don't see North Korea as a major power. It's an irritant.
I mean, how do other agencies work on country?
It's very difficult because it's a closed society. It's the hermit kingdom. So it becomes really difficult when you are having to get information from a closed society. Getting information from the US is easy. It's an open book. So is India. At the end of the day, everyone in India wants to talk. Everyone in America wants to talk. There are not that many secrets in both these lands. But North Korea, good luck, mate.
I mean, there are many things which come out, but they are true, or they might be true.
Yeah, it's all a game of he says, she says, they say, I say, yada yada. You don't really know, but that's why having good intelligence is important, because then you can sift out signal from noise and you can say, this seems probably true and this is probably untrue, because you've got to constantly sort of look at the balance of probabilities and weigh the evidence, just as you do in some ways in a courtroom. What do you do? What is happening in a court of law? One party says ABC, this is my plea, and then the other party says DEF, and this is my plea, and the judge says, in the balance of probabilities, in a civil case. In a criminal case, it is beyond reasonable doubt. That's a separate thing. That's why investigation is very different too. Intelligence, because in intelligence, it's always gray. You're weighing probabilities. It's balance
That
of
nation
probabilities.
threats everyone with nuclear weapons. That nation threats everyone with nuclear weapons. And
Not
the
everyone.
agencies can't do anything.
It won't fire at Pakistan. It won't fire at China. It won't even fire at India. Don't worry. It'll fire at South Korea and Japan. It's okay. It's not okay, by the way, but it doesn't threaten everyone. That's not true. Okay?
Good evening, sir. So, in one of the discussion, you mentioned about the social reforms which India need.
Social or institutional or political?
Fundamental reforms. Fundamental reforms.
Fundamental reforms, yeah. The
So-
state. I talked about the state.
Yes,
I'm
state
not talking of
colonization.
social reforms. Raja Ram Mohan Roy did that. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar did that. Lots of great people have talked about it in the past. B.R. Ambedkar did that. I'm a pygmy, so I try to steer clear of talking about social reforms most of the time, but I'm talking about reform of the colonial state.
Yes, sir. So, could you please highlight what kind of reforms?
Oh, so many. Let me ask you, why don't we have elected mayors? Why not? Every state is ruled by a chief minister with 2 IS officers. That's it. Why don't you vote a mayor and you vote out a mayor every 5 years? Do you know who collects rubbish in your town? No, why don't you? Or how does the tax system work? Right? Well, how do we hire better tax collectors? How do we train them better? How do we make a lot has improved, but we can improve it a lot more. Got it? So what we need is better selection, better training, and better evaluation. So many of the members of the Indian state, once you become a part of the Indian elite, then you become a sahab. You're a bada sahab. I was just taking the plane to come here, and there was a fascinating sight. You know, a portly gentleman, obviously some officer, had bodyguards, and he got out. He didn't even, pick up his briefcase, and his wife got out, and their bag was put on a trolley, and it's like, hang on a minute, this is taxpayer money. There was a time I was an officer in the government. I used to take the flight myself. I used to carry my own laptop bag. I came here carrying my own stuff. It's good for you. You'll avoid diabetes and heart attacks if you do that. But it seems our elite loves diabetes and heart attacks. So they want 20 people around them, one to massage their feet, another to ruffle their hair and give them, a head massage. I mean, that has to change. Get it? And we have to have respect for domain knowledge and domain expertise. Right now, the Indian Police Service heads investigation, heads paramilitary, heads intelligence. Why? Why? The Indian Administrative Service heads Central Board of Secondary Education. The Archaeological Survey of India hangs out in the Finance Ministry. One day they'll be in culture, the second day in agriculture, and the third day in finance. Does that make sense?
No, sir.
Good. So that is what we have to reform. Lots of things. Politically, we have to reform as well. Our parliament has to have debates. They have to ask questions. The job of the MPs is not just campaigning and spending, I heard 5 to 7 crores is what you need to run. Today, over lunch, your professor very kindly took me out for lunch. And our mutual friend told us that, an MLA election is 1 to 2 crores. Do I remember the numbers correctly? And yeah, sure, you spend that, you win. But then what? What is the job of the parliament? To write laws and to hold the feet of the powerful to the fire. So the Indian Penal Code is 1860, drafted 3 years after 1857, 2 years after Queen Victoria took over in 1858. The Indian Police Act is 1861. So when you walk into a police station, let's assume you are slapped. Someone doesn't like your face and slaps you really hard and you lose your hearing. You walk to the police station, you say, I've been assaulted. Please register a case. The envelope of right and wrong is the same as that decided by Lord Macaulay, who also wrote the Minute of 1835. So your education and the social contract of right and wrong was drafted by one British colonial, Mr. James Bond. And you're happy with it. Why? That's what we have to reform. We have to reform that colonial state, that system. Got it? With me? Great. Righty here, we are done. Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor. It's always a pleasure to be back here. I can see my star power has diminished. There was a time when this hall used to be full. Clearly I'm aging. I'm losing hair, muscle, and eyesight. Soon I'll be dead, you know, and there'll be only 1 or 2 people in my cortege. That's what I've got to look forward to. On that rather cheery note, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, evening, afternoon, wherever in the world you happen to be. Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.